For Bobby Fischer, this game was especially exhilarating because it was the first time he was able to defeat one of his scariest opponents, the legendary attacking genius Mikhail Tal. And okay, I know this picture is from the 1980s. When this game was actually played back in 1961, Tal looked like this, but he was no less frightening, having been dethroned as world champion only 6 months earlier. Now, Fischer had played Tal a handful of times before this game, but he had a terrible record against him, losing 4 times with a couple of draws. But Fischer, now 18 years old, is eager to prove his world-class ability against this chess monster. And so, in the second round of this super tournament held in Bled, Yugoslavia, now known as Slovenia, featuring many of the world's strongest grandmasters, Bobby Fischer, playing white, kicks off this game with his favorite move, e4. And Tal comes out swinging with a Sicilian defense, heading into a Taimanov variation with the move e6, which is conducive to the early development of the dark squared bishop at the cost of weakening this d6 square. Here Fischer plays the move that is most popular today, knight to c3. But in his subsequent analysis of this game, which we will be tapping into fairly heavily along with some of the post-mortem thoughts of Tal as well, giving us a glimpse into the minds of these two chess giants, Fischer remarked that he thought that knight to b5 might be best, but he avoided it because he thought it's what Tal would expect. And this move is not so popular anymore. The following line, given by Fischer as being best for white, will look familiar to you Sveshnikov players, except here white loses a tempo by getting his bishop to g5 in 3 moves instead of 2 like we see in the main line today. But Fischer still thought this favored white, though the engine says it's about equal. So it seems that back in the 1960s, black's weaknesses, the backward pawn on d6 and the hole on d5, were considered to be worse than they actually are. But in the game, Fischer went with the move considered strongest today, knight to c3. We have queen to c7 from Tal, adding defense to that hole on d6. You don't want a knight to land there. So if knight to b5 comes, that queen can drop back and d6 still has the double coverage. g3, now played by Fischer, came as a bit of a surprise to Tal since bishop to e3 is more common. But this move does carry a threat, as it supports bishop to f4, furthering the attack on these dark squares in conjunction with the move knight to b5, a move which Tal now decided to prevent with a6. But here something very odd happened. According to Tal, after writing down a6 on his score sheet, he got up from the board thinking that he had played that move, only to return to see that Fischer had responded knight d to b5. And after briefly thinking Fischer had made some strange sacrifice, he realized to his horror that he had not played a6, but through some unexplainable mental lapse had moved his knight to f6 instead, which Fischer said was probably the losing move. And after his response knight d to b5, Tal described black's position as perhaps lost. However, it was later discovered that black is not lost at all at this point, and after queen to b8 from Tal, keeping an eye on d6, and bishop to f4 from Fischer, the real blunder of the game was this move knight to e5. What Tal should have played here was e5, leading to this variation that was thought to be losing at the time, where white plays bishop to g5, threatening to take out the knight, followed by knight to d5, hitting f6, ganging up on c7. So a6 is really necessary, and after bishop takes f6, you want to take on b5. These are all engine moves, by the way, but after bishop to g5, Tal didn't know how he would proceed, saying that, quote, good advice for black is at a premium. A statement which, if true, makes bishop to b4 a pretty valuable move. As originally suggested by the grandmaster Robert Hubner and later verified by engines, this move gives black a very playable game, happily sacrificing the pawn on b5 in order to shatter white's queenside pawn structure with bishop takes c3 check, and after b takes c3, white is still the preferred side, but is not even close to winning. So let's contrast this with the move played by Tal in the game, which is knight to e5, blocking this bishop's diagonal with this self-pin of the knight to the queen. Looks sketchy, but how do you punish this as white? It's not really obvious. You'd like to play queen to d4 and increase pressure, but this fails to the fork on f3. So what would you play here? See if you can spot the engine-like move that Fischer uncorked in this position. In 3, 2, 1. Bishop to e2 is the strongest move, maybe the only winning move, stopping any knight to f3 nonsense, and so threatening queen to d4. At which point Tal went into a 1.5 hour think, using up a huge chunk of his time trying to figure out what to do. So before I show you what he came up with, let's check out a couple alternative options. Starting with a6, trying to boot that b5 knight while you can. This fails to queen to d4, hitting the pinned knight twice. When taking the knight on b5 would crash and burn to bishop takes e5, hitting f6, hitting the queen. Better is to defend with d6, but now here comes rook to d1, which doesn't lose a piece to a takes b5 since bishop takes e5 is exploiting the pinned d-pawn due to the mate threat on d8. So best is to retreat the knight to d7, hitting the bishop, and should white now take on d6 and liquidate the position? No, you want to capture on b5, pinning the knight and ready to win the piece on d7 with a crushing position if black dares capture on e5. And this capture on b5 demonstrates why Fischer's move bishop to e2 was superior than bishop to g2, in case anyone was wondering. But getting back to our game position, it turns out that black's best defensive try here is the ridiculous looking knight to g8, whose sole function is to allow f6, defending the knight on e5 that way. And Tal actually found this move after the game, but as you can imagine, a move like this is not typically going to be your salvation from a lost position, and this is no exception. But now let's look at what Tal actually played. Bishop to c5. Okay, looks sensible. You're stopping queen to d4. And this move requires Fischer to again be very accurate. White has only one crushing move here. See if you can spot it. In 3, 2, 1, bishop takes e5. A move which wouldn't be nearly as good if this bishop were still on f8. Here's why. Queen takes e5 is followed by f4 from Fischer. And the queen would love to go to c5 and stay active, but with the bishop sitting there, you can only drop back to b8. Fischer continues e5, hitting the knight on f6, which is running short on squares. Both Fischer and Tal mentioned that knight to g8 would fail to knight to e4, attacking the bishop, and eyeing up d6 with the two knights, where one of them is going to be making a home. Not good at all. So the only reasonable try is the counterattack, a6. You got to eliminate one of these ponies, but after e takes f6, a takes b5, Fischer plays f takes g7, highlighting another defect of the move bishop to c5 in that it's not there to capture. So rook to g8 is forced. Next comes knight to e4, hitting the bishop. It goes to e7. Got to prevent the knight fork. Queen d4 next, renewing the possibility of knight to f6 with check, which would force the trade, and then with the white queen sitting there on f6, bishop to h5 becomes a big problem. So Tal, in what Fischer calls a desperate attempt to complicate, plays rook to a4, which to me looks more like an attempt to clarify the situation, as it forces Fischer to play knight to f6 now, if he's going to play it at all. So after bishop takes f6 and queen takes f6, Fischer's threats are more clearly defined, and Tal can now take concrete measures to try to defend. And here Tal mentioned that if he could get his queen to d4 via a7 and exchange queens, the resulting endgame would be, quote, paradise. Which may be true relative to what happened in the game, though the engine says that even that would be hopeless for black. But bishop h5 is coming much too quickly for that to work anyway, so what's tried is queen to c7, preparing to meet bishop to h5 with d5, providing some lateral defense that way. He's also threatening to get some counterplay with queen takes c2. Then if white tries bishop to h5, then it's the white king who starts getting harassed with queen to e4 check. When white will not be able to avoid putting his king on f2 without running into major problems, which will result in black forcing the trade of queens. So what does Fischer do? He makes the best move, castling long, which takes a lot of guts because it allows rook takes a2, which looks very scary. While Fischer has succeeded in defending c2, getting his rook into an attacking position very quickly, he seems to have gifted black some dangerous counterplay on the a file. What are you doing about queen to a5 followed by rook to a1? Well, Fischer begins with king to b1, having foreseen that queen to a5 can now be met with b3. And with double coverage of a1, Black's heavy pieces can do nothing more than, as Tal put it, send a farewell kiss to their king. I just love Tal's comments, by the way. He's one of my favorite chess personalities and players of all time. He loved the game, and unlike Fischer, he played right up until the very end of his life. But pressing on, we have rook to a6. Tal realizes that defending this rank is going to be more important now than playing the rook to a5 to defend the b-pawn, which Fischer captures next, which is winning, but he underestimated how powerful bishop to h5 would have been. Because here, if Black tries to defend f7 with d5, then you can sack the rook, opening the e-file and follow up with rook to e1 check, when rook to e6 is no defense due to the pin on the f-pawn. That rook will be inadequately defended. So Black has to try d6 instead, which brings into focus the point of having the rook on a6, defending against a rook sack on d6, since if you capture with the queen, f7 is left undefended. And here White has a variety of crushing options. For example, rook h to e1, threatening to take twice on e6 due to the pin on the f-pawn. And if queen to e7, adding defense, there's just queen to h6, threatening to take on h7, to which Black has no good defense. But Fischer, in this position, grabs the material with bishop takes b5, rook to b6 now attacks the bishop, opposite the white king, and eyeing the white queen. It's as good a try as any, and a move that we can be grateful that Tal played, as it sets the stage for Fischer's spectacular finish, which we are about to see. Bishop to d3 now played, simply threatening to capture on h7, but this allows a discovered attack on the white queen with e5. Tal is desperate to get those queens off the board and is hoping for queen takes e5 check, followed by queen takes queen and rook takes g7, which the engine says is still totally winning for White, but it would give Black some practical chances for survival. Fischer does not capture on e5, however. He plays a much more brilliant and devastating move. You may have already guessed what it is, but if not, take a moment, pause the video, try to spot White's best move. In 3, 2, 1. F takes e5. A queen sacrifice of epic proportion, and a move which Tal described with a single word: naturally. Tal, of course, being himself one of the greatest sacrificers in the history of chess. He accepts the queen with rook takes f6. There's really nothing better, but after e takes f6, there's no good defense to bishop takes h7. That rook on g8 is gonna fall. But Tal has seen that he can at least eliminate Fischer's f and g pawns, starting with queen to c5, following bishop takes h7 with queen to g5, hitting f6. Now if White were to defend that pawn with rook to f1, then rook takes g7 will just pick up the two pawns that way. So Fischer plays the stronger move, bishop takes g8, so that after queen takes f6, now he can play rook h to f1, following queen takes g7 with bishop takes f7 check, winning the f-pawn. And with Fischer's two rooks and two pawns for the sacrificed queen, his king relatively safe, and Black's horribly inactive bishop on c8, there is little hope for Tal. But he plays on a bit, with king to d8. We have bishop to e6 from Fischer, the d-pawn is pinned, and he's threatening rook to f7. Queen to h6 attacks both the bishop and the pawn on h2, but Fischer sees that he can take on d7, since after bishop takes d7, he's got rook to f7. The bishop is pinned to the king, and he's going to get that piece back. The h-pawn falls, and so does the bishop, with check. We have king to e8, rook d to e7 check, king to d8, at which point Tal correctly pointed out that Fischer's best move was rook takes b7, giving this crazy line where the white king gets chased all over the place, and eventually it makes its way up the board, all the way to the 8th rank, when Black runs out of checks, and Tal said that Fischer was playing very carefully by avoiding this in the game, and playing rook to d7 check, and then after a couple more checks, he drops his rook back to d1 to prevent that queen to h1. So it's kind of interesting that Tal describes Fischer as being very careful. I wouldn't dream of letting my king get chased around like that if I had any winning alternatives at all. But when you have the calculating ability of Fischer or Tal, maybe this does seem like a very careful way to play. b5 now played by Tal, so Fischer attacks that pawn again with rook to b7. Queen to h5 defends, and now we get g4, a move which is much more crushing than it first appears, as it forces Tal to either abandon the defense of his b pawn or give up control of the h file, which is even worse. For example, if you take on g4, Fischer gives this variation, rook to h1, threatening mate in 1, and if you try to defend with queen to d4, then rook to h8 comes anyway. Since after queen takes h8, there's rook to b8, which is going to pick up the queen. So Tal, realizing he's got to stay on this h-file, plays queen to h3. But after g5, Fischer is just going to pick up the b-pawn. Queen to f3 attacks the rook on d1. We have rook to e1 check, king to f8. The rook grabs on b5. Tal plays king to g7. Maybe he wants king to g6, but Fischer cuts off the king with rook to b6. Queen to g3 attacks the rook. It goes to d1. Tal plays queen to c7, guarding against rook to d7, but now rook to d6 is just as crushing, with the idea of getting his rooks to h7 and g7 with check to force the king this way. If you go to f8, there's going to be rook to h8, forcing the king to f7 or e7, followed by the winning of the queen with rook to h7. And that black queen is very limited on where she can go, since she is defending against a laddering of the black king by those rooks. What's tried is queen to c8. We have b3 now from Fischer. Looks a bit odd, but I think he's just trying to eliminate any possibility of a perpetual check, even though black wouldn't have had one anyway. But this would allow the king to hide on a2 with this diagonal blocked by the pawn, and then rook to a6 is there to guard the a file. And then this rook is here to guard c2 if necessary, even though it probably won't be. So here Fischer is being ultra careful. He doesn't want to botch this first win of his life against the great Tal, who now realizing that there is no point to moving his queen, just plays king to h7. And after rook to a6 from Fischer, Tal resigns. He has no good way to prevent Fischer from doubling his rooks on the 7th rank, and he will have to give up his queen to avoid imminent checkmate. So for example, if king to g7, rook to a7 check, king to g8, rook d to d7, and let's say queen to b8. Here there's rook to g7 check, king to h8, rook to h7 check, which, as in the line we looked at earlier, will allow white to drive the black king away from the corner and the game.